From banned IVs to drug tests no one talks about, have you ever wondered what's really happening behind the scenes at the UFC? Today, we're uncovering the 7 explosive scandals that reveal a very different side of the sport. Number 1, UFC allowing Greg Hardy to compete despite past domestic violence allegations. What does it take to make it into the UFC? For Greg Hardy, the real question was what it took to stay there despite a dark past. Hardy's athletic background had set him up for success. Before stepping into the octagon, he'd already made his name as a dominant NFL defensive end. But his football career came to a screeching halt in 2014 when he was arrested for assaulting his ex-girlfriend. Details of the case were harrowing, with the victim claiming Hardy threw her onto a couch full of firearms and threatened her life. Though he was originally found guilty in a bench trial, the charges were later dropped when the victim refused to testify during his appeal. The damage to his NFL career, however, was already done. Hardy became a free agent, and soon his football days were behind him. When he transitioned to MMA and eventually signed with the UFC in 2018, there was immediate backlash. Fans, fighters, and advocates questioned the message the organization was sending. To them, it seemed like the UFC was willing to compromise its values for publicity. Dana White stood firm, framing it as a story of redemption and second chances. However, many believed it was an excuse to capitalize on Hardy's notoriety.
Number 2. Dana White slapping his wife in public. What happens when the face of the UFC becomes the center of a scandal? For Dana White, it wasn't just business, it was personal. In January 2023, Dana White was caught on camera during an altercation with his wife, Anne, while celebrating New Year's Eve in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. The video showed the two arguing in a nightclub before White slapped her across the face. She immediately retaliated, slapping him back, but the moment had already been captured and quickly spread online. The incident shocked fans and critics alike, with many struggling to reconcile it with White's role as the leader of the UFC. The backlash was swift. Critics slammed White for the hypocrisy of his actions, pointing to the UFC's historical condemnation of athlete misconduct. In the past, fighters accused of domestic violence faced intense scrutiny, suspensions, or outright releases from the company. Yet, in White's case, there seemed to be no immediate consequences. The incident raised difficult questions about accountability. For many, it wasn't just White's reputation that was tarnished, but the credibility of the UFC as a whole. Number 3, fighter pay, the UFC's most heated debate. How much is a fighter's blood, sweat, and tears worth? For the UFC, this question has haunted them for years. Years of punches, discipline, and sheer endurance don't always mean financial security. And for many UFC fighters, this reality comes as a harsh wake-up call. Critics have long argued that athletes in the UFC earn alarmingly less compared to those in other major sports leagues. While stars like Conor McGregor rake in tens of millions from pay-per-view cuts and endorsements, those figures don't represent the majority of fighters climbing their way up the ranks. In fact, many on preliminary fight cards reportedly make as little as $10,000 per fight, often having to cover their own training expenses, coaches, and travel fees. This pay structure has earned the UFC heavy criticism. High-profile names like Francis Ngannou and Jake Paul have become outspoken advocates for change, highlighting what they see as an unfair revenue split. For perspective, fighters take home around 16 to 20% of the UFC's revenue, a stark contrast to the 48 to 50% athletes receive in leagues like the NFL and NBA. Number 4. The secret use of IVs after USADA's ban. What happens when the rules don't apply to everyone? In the UFC's world, loopholes can be just as controversial as outright cheating. Back in 2015, the UFC joined forces with USADA to introduce one of the strictest anti-doping programs in sports. One major change was the banning of intravenous, IV, infusions. These were often used by fighters to rehydrate after intense weight cuts, but they could also mask the presence of performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs. To prevent abuse, USADA prohibited the use of IVs over 50 milliliters within a 6-hour window, except in cases of documented medical emergencies. Even then, prior approval was required. It seemed like a strong step toward fairness, but whispers of exceptions for high-profile fighters began circulating. Although no conclusive evidence has surfaced, rumors of selective enforcement have lingered. Critics speculated that some stars received quiet medical exemptions, raising eyebrows about special treatment. The controversy wasn't just about IV use. It cast doubt on the entire anti-doping program's credibility. Was the ban being upheld equally for all athletes, or were certain fighters being protected? Number 5, Jon Jones, greatness overshadowed by drug test failures.
How does one of the greatest fighters in UFC history also become one of its most controversial? Jon Jones' story is as complicated as it gets. Jones' career is a collection of unmatched highs and self-inflicted lows. At 23, he became the youngest champion in UFC history, defeating Mauricio Shogun Rua at UFC 128. But his dominance in the sport was repeatedly overshadowed by a series of drug test failures. The first major incident was in 2015, when a pre-fight test revealed a cocaine metabolite in his system. While it wasn't banned out of competition, the revelation embarrassed the UFC and forced Jones to enter rehab. It was a shocking moment for fans, but it was only the beginning. Shortly after, Jones failed a drug test ahead of UFC 200 for banned substances clomiphene and letrozole, often linked to masking steroid use. He denied knowingly using PEDs, but his suspension cast doubt on his integrity. Then came the 2017 Turinabol scandal after his rematch with Daniel Cormier. The fight was overturned to a no contest, and Jones faced another suspension. USADA still allowed him to return, sparking claims of favoritism.
Number 6, Kabib versus McGregor. The fight that turned into chaos. What happens when the biggest rivalry in UFC history spills out of the cage? For Kabib and McGregor, it wasn't just a fight, it was a war. The bad blood between Kabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor started long before UFC 229. Tensions began when Khabib's team confronted McGregor's teammate, Artem Lobov, in a heated exchange that quickly got personal. But things truly escalated during the infamous bus attack at UFC 223. McGregor and his entourage stormed the Barclays Center, hurling objects at a bus carrying Kabib and other fighters. Broken windows led to injuries for Michael Chiesa and Ray Borg, canceling their bouts and putting McGregor in legal trouble. This moment turned their rivalry into a spectacle, with McGregor using the lead-up to the fight to push buttons. His trash talk mocked Khabib's family, faith, and nationality, raising the stakes to a boiling point. The fallout was massive. Fines and suspensions followed, including a 9-month suspension for Kabib. Despite the UFC's biggest ever pay-per-view numbers, the aftermath raised serious questions about promoting such volatile rivalries. Number 7. The Power Slap League. A backlash waiting to happen. What's more controversial than MMA? For the UFC, it was their attempt to turn slap fighting into a legitimate sport. The Power Slap League, introduced with the backing of the UFC, immediately ignited heated debate. At its core, the sport involved competitors taking turns delivering unprotected slaps to each other, aiming for maximum force, often with no option to block or defend. Critics, including medical experts, fans, and even MMA fighters, were quick to call it out for glorifying unnecessary violence. The issue wasn't just about the spectacle. Serious concerns about long-term health effects, including traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, were brought to the forefront. Doctors highlighted the risks associated with repeated head trauma, like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, and concussions. The format, which emphasized brute strength over any kind of strategy or athleticism, only made the dangers more glaring. Social media buzzed with clips of participants being knocked unconscious or suffering visible injuries, prompting widespread outrage. These moments amplified the backlash, with many questioning whether this entertainment crossed an ethical line. The UFC's history shows the constant push and pull of ambition and controversy. From shady decisions to glaring ethical missteps, it's a legacy that perfectly mirrors the raw unpredictability of the sport itself. As the UFC fought to shed its reputation as human cockfighting, its evolution into a billion-dollar industry brought new challenges. These scandals highlight the struggle between progress and compromise. Decisions made for entertainment often came at a cost. But what does the future hold? Will the organization continue skating these ethical edges, or will it rise to meet the growing expectations of its athletes and fans? That answer is up to them.